Hi, and welcome to my video blog about win-win communication. And communication is clearly a massive subject, but for the purpose of this video, we're going to focus very much on how to achieve a very positive two-way engagement with somebody that we want to have a positive relationship with on an ongoing basis. So somebody that's important to us, possibly a family member, friend, or a work colleague. And the first thing to bear in mind is something that is very obvious but quite often overlooked. The fact that actually there's two of you in this conversation. So a lot of people perhaps would engage with somebody else and be very much in their own mind and thinking of their own needs and their own perspective, etc. But if you want to become really skilled at communicating and achieving a win-win outcome, that's a success for both of you, then I would encourage you to also strongly consider the other person in this process. So as an instance, the first thing to consider is the actual physical and mental state of that other person. So for example, are they in a good mood, in a happy place, friendly and relaxed, feeling physically well and on top of their game? Or are they perhaps in a bad mood? Maybe they're suffering with stress and anxiety. Maybe they're in physical pain and not feeling too good about themselves. So you've got to be mindful of all that to start with. And in particular, always ask yourself a few questions before you actually start with something that's a sort of a serious conversation, in terms of, am I the right person to be having this conversation? And perhaps if it's a work colleague, you might want to think about, well, is this better conducted by a senior manager, a supervisor, or just somebody who's on the same wavelength as this person? It's also a case of making sure it's the right time, the right place, the right subjects you're going to be discussing, and that of course you handle it in the right manner. So there's a lot of basics you just need to run quickly through your mind to make sure you frame the context of this conversation you're going to be having, assuming it's something that's quite important to the two of you. Another thing to consider is, how well do you really understand this other person, their personality, their traits and behaviours, and what their feelings and needs might be. Being mindful that we all, within us, contain a number of filters. For instance, we'll all have our own life values, our own attitudes and beliefs, and that all frames our mindset towards any engagement with another person. And it's also worth bearing in mind that we're all shaped by three main drivers, which will be our genetics, our upbringing, particularly in the first 7 years of our life, and also our life experiences. So that all drives and creates the person that we become. There's issues around culture and language to be mindful of, and perhaps in the workplace being particularly mindful of what terms and perhaps jargon people will be familiar with or not. So for instance, a conversation with a work colleague where you can use a lot of acronyms and perhaps technical words that they'll be familiar with, if you bring that in at home and try and talk to a family member in a similar way, half the time they wouldn't have a clue what you're talking about. So it's all about adjusting your language to meet the needs of the person so that you can achieve the outcome that you want to get. Another key factor to bear in mind is that all of us are prone during conversation or communication to delete, distort and generalise. So it's very difficult sometimes to know what is the actual truth, isn't it? So if we just accept that principle, that we do that to some degree and the other person is likely to delete, distort and generalise, then that takes us some way to be able to understand conversations and perhaps shape things towards a positive outcome. In terms of our own behaviour, of course, if we can minimise the tendency to delete, distort and generalise and be very much focused on factual information, then the more likely we are to have a sort of a positive, accurate conversation. Now, before we move on to discuss the details of how to actually achieve win-win communication, let's talk just for a moment about the benefits to be gained from doing it, because it's from there that we actually build a sense of motivation and purpose to want to put some of the following tools and techniques into practice. So, as the title of win-win communication would imply, it's very much about achieving outcomes that are good for you, but also great for the other person as well. So it actually takes us beyond win-lose conversations or even compromise conversations into something that's even bigger and better than that. And it's even more than just achieving really great outcomes. It's also about removing a lot of negativity, because from that flows the feeling of mutual trust and respect that you build between yourself and the other person. It also removes a lot of negative emotions, particularly things like anxiety, stress, and all those tensions and things that distract us if we're not having good conversations or engaging in good communication with another person. So there's a huge number of reasons to put the effort into learning how to achieve win-win communication. So we're going to move on now to discuss what I call the 6 C's of win-win communication. The first one of which is being calm. Very much about being in the moment and focusing on that conversation, putting other matters to one side, being in the moment, in the room, in that conversation, as opposed to your mind being distracted by other things. And if you're not doing that, the other person can very quickly pick up the fact that you're not actually there concentrating and focusing on them. So practice calming your mind, letting go of other concerns, other matters that may be happening, and being very much calm and in that conversation. The second C is about control. And this refers to being in control of yourself as opposed to seeking to control the other person. It's very much about recognizing that whichever way the conversation goes, you have the freedom to choose your own thoughts, your own reactions, and your own words. So you can control your contribution to that conversation through your own listening and observation skills and seeking to understand the thoughts, feelings, emotions, and needs of the other person. And being mindful that whatever is said, you still have the freedom to choose your own attitude. And even if the other person becomes quite agitated, perhaps even aggressive, you do not have to take on board that cloak. So you can stay in your own comfortable, safe place. You can either choose to agree or disagree, but at the same time, you control your reaction. And by doing that, it takes you another step forward to achieving a win-win outcome. The third C is about being confident. Knowing who you are and the personal strengths and positive attributes you bring to that conversation. Maybe if it's in the work context, you'll understand that you've got some technical expertise, some business skills and knowledge that you are bringing that are specific to you. So it's not something that you need to constantly remind the other person about, but if you are mindful of that and carry it within you, then it clearly becomes evident to that other person, and you build that persona of confidence, and you have every right to. The next skill is to be concise, and clearly this is something I need to be very brief about. So being concise is about being accurate, relevant and timely, making sure you're very sort of succinct and clear in what you're saying, as opposed to saying too much. So I'm sure you've experienced situations where sometimes the other person talks so much that it actually causes confusion, or it can actually undermine the point you're trying to make. So far better to be very brief, concise, succinct in what you want to say, keep to the point. And on that note, I'll stop there. The fifth C is about clarity. And that really is very much about using the appropriate language. Being mindful that there's three main elements to communication. First of all, the words. Secondly, vocality, which is very much about tone, pace, tempo, volume. And thirdly is body language. But in terms of clarity, we are thinking about the 7% of words being a small percentage of the overall elements of communication, but the words can be absolutely critical. So be very mindful that you're using appropriate language and the right word for what you're actually trying to convey. But also be mindful that everything else you do behind that, with that vocality and with your body language, will support what you're trying to say. The sixth and final skill to foster win-win communication is to be curious. And that means that you're really genuinely interested in the other person, that you're looking to develop an in-depth understanding of where they're really coming from and what their emotions and feelings are, maybe some of their experiences, but importantly also what their needs are and where they would want to take this conversation, what they would want to achieve as outcomes. So from there you can develop shared understanding and move forward to achieve these win-win outcomes that we keep talking about. So to conclude, here's a quick reminder of the 6 C's of win-win communication. And this is starting to feel like a scene from Love Actually, if you've ever seen that movie. But keeping this nice and simple. So the first word, if you remember, was about being calm. What comes next? Being in control of yourself, of course, not necessarily seeking to control the other person. The third one is about being confident, concise, clarity, and finally about being curious. And that's all, folks. Hopefully those 6 C's will help you. Remember, like any skill, it needs to be implemented and practiced and sharpened over time. But I'm sure if you apply those 6 C's, you'll achieve some real win-win outcomes.